AITA for secretly recording my professor making sexist remarks and getting him fired. Alright, I didn't think I'd be writing this, but here I am. This whole thing has gotten way bigger than I ever imagined, and honestly, I'm still trying to figure out if I did the right thing or if I completely screwed up. So I'm in my final year of university, and I had this professor, let's just call him Dr. R, who seemed kind of weird from the start. At first, I thought he was just one of those old-fashioned guys who didn't really know how to talk to students. He had this dry, sarcastic way of teaching that some people found funny, but there was always something about him that rubbed me the wrong way. At first, it was little things, stuff you could brush off if you weren't really paying attention. He'd always call on male students way more often, even when girls clearly had their hands up. If a girl did answer, he'd either act surprised or kind of brush it off like she just got lucky. I didn't really think much of it back then. I figured maybe he just had favorites or was the type of guy who stuck to a few familiar faces. But then things got worse. I remember one time he said, right in the middle of class, that women just aren't as naturally gifted in logic-based subjects. People kind of laughed awkwardly, but I remember looking around and seeing a few girls exchange looks like they couldn't believe what they'd just heard. Another time, a girl asked a pretty standard question about the material, and he snorted and said something like, if female students spent less time worrying about their looks and more time studying, maybe they'd get better grades. That one hit hard because this girl, she was quiet, but I knew she was one of the smartest people in the room. You could see how embarrassed she was, but she just swallowed it and didn't say anything. It started to feel like he was doing this on purpose. Every time we had a tough topic, he'd say crap like, this might be a little hard for the girls, but don't worry. Just smile at your lab partners and they'll help you out. I kept trying to convince myself he was just an asshole who didn't realize how bad he sounded. But then one day it went way past that. It was one of those unbearably hot days where everyone's sweaty and miserable. This girl, same one he embarrassed before, came to class in a tank top. Nothing weird or inappropriate, just a regular summer outfit. Right in the middle of class, he stopped what he was saying, pointed directly at her and said, "Wow, dressing like that for extra credit? Bold strategy." I'll never forget her face. She looked like she wanted to disappear. A few guys laughed, but most people just kind of froze, like they couldn't believe he said that out loud. That's when I knew I had to do something. I started recording him. Nothing fancy, just set my phone on my desk and hit record whenever class started. I didn't even know what I was planning to do with it at first, but I figured if he kept pulling this crap, I'd have proof. Over the next few weeks, I caught so much on tape that I honestly couldn't believe he'd been getting away with this for so long. He kept going on about how women should stick to easier fields because STEM was too stressful for them. He joked that girls should marry smart guys instead of trying to be them. But the one that really got me, the one that made me decide I couldn't just sit on this, was when he flat out told a girl that she should stick to homemaking if she couldn't handle the pressure of a technical degree. I couldn't let that slide. I took all the recordings, weeks worth, and emailed them anonymously to the university's disciplinary committee. I didn't put my name on it because I wasn't trying to make it about me. I just wanted him gone. It didn't take long. About a month later, word spread that Dr. R had been fired. Apparently, the school found enough in my recordings to prove a pattern of behavior that went back years. Girls from previous classes started coming forward, saying they'd been treated the same way but never reported it because they didn't think anyone would believe them. That's when the backlash hit. Most of the female students were relieved. Some even thanked me personally. But a lot of the guys, especially the ones who thought Dr. R was just joking around, were pissed. They kept saying I ruined a man's career over a few jokes and that I should have just ignored him. It's been weeks, and things are still tense. A couple of my friends barely talk to me anymore. One guy cornered me outside class and said I was a snitch who didn't know how to take a joke. Even my roommates have been weird about it, like they're trying to stay neutral but clearly think I overreacted. I don't know, man. I keep telling myself I did the right thing, but sometimes I wonder if I just made everything worse. After Dr. R got fired, things got weird fast. At first, I figured everything would blow over in a few days. The guy was a creep. Anyone paying attention knew that. And I thought once people processed what happened, they'd realize I'd done the right thing. But that's not how it played out. The tension hit hard in class. Some guys wouldn't even look in my direction. I'd overhear whispers from people saying I'd gone too far or that I was some kind of social justice warrior who couldn't take a joke. I caught one guy calling me a rat under his breath when I walked past him in the hallway. There was this weird divide in the class now. Most of the girls seemed relieved Dr. R was gone, but a lot of the guys were acting like I'd gotten a beloved uncle dragged out in cuffs. It didn't take long before it spilled outside of class. One evening, I was walking back to my place after grabbing dinner when I noticed two guys from my class leaning against a wall down the street. They weren't doing anything, just standing there, but I could tell they were watching me. I ignored it, but when I got closer, one of them called out. I don't remember exactly what he said, but it was something about me stabbing one of my own in the back. I picked up my pace, but they followed for a bit. Nothing happened. They didn't touch me or anything, but the whole thing stuck with me. After that, I stopped going out alone unless I had to. Then things started happening at home. I lived with two guys, both students, and we'd always gotten along fine. They weren't exactly my closest friends, but we split rent, drank beers on weekends, and shared grocery runs when it made sense. After the Dr. R thing, though, they started acting different. It wasn't anything obvious at first. They'd leave without saying anything, even if I was sitting right there. One day I came back from class and one of them had moved all my stuff off the living room table. I didn't even care about that, but when I asked why, he just muttered something about how I ruined the whole semester and left the room. The worst part was when they had people over. I'd be in my room and I'd hear them talking loud enough that they knew I could hear. One night I heard one of them going off about how I'd destroyed some guy's life over jokes and how people like me ruin everything. There was this girl laughing along with him like it was funny. At that point, I knew I needed to get out of that apartment. I called my mom the next day and asked if I could crash at home for a bit. She didn't ask questions, just said yes. My parents live about an hour away, so I figured I'd stay there for a couple weeks, clear my head, and figure out what to do next. What I didn't expect was for things to get worse at home. I should have known something was up when I walked in the door and my dad didn't say much. My mom gave me a hug, but Dad barely looked away from the TV. That night at dinner, he barely said a word to me. When I asked him what was wrong, he just shook his head. Later that night, my mom knocked on my door and told me Dad was upset about what happened with Dr. R. I didn't even know how he'd found out, but apparently one of his friends, some guy from the golf club, knew Dr. R personally, said he was a good guy who'd been dealt a bad hand. My dad wasn't mad at me exactly, but he thought I'd made things harder for myself by sticking my nose where it didn't belong. I didn't know what to say. My dad's one of those guys who thinks hard work fixes everything, and standing up to people like Dr. R? That's not how he operates. He just gritted his teeth and let things slide. I could tell he thought I should have done the same. The next morning, things got worse. I was heading out to grab coffee when my uncle, Dad's brother, showed up unannounced. He doesn't visit much, and when he does, it's usually because something's wrong. I was halfway out the door when I heard him talking to Dad in the kitchen. He was going off about me, saying I'd turned into one of those weak-minded kids, and that I was screwing over good men because I couldn't handle a few rough jokes. I wanted to ignore it, but then he brought up my cousin. I'd forgotten this, but my cousin, my uncle's son, had taken Dr. R's class a couple years ago. Apparently, he and Dr. R had gotten along really well. My uncle was pissed because now that Dr. R was fired, my cousin's letter of recommendation was useless. He started saying I'd messed with his son's future and that I should have just minded my own business. That was the moment I realized how far this whole thing had spread. It wasn't just about Dr. R anymore. Now people were acting like I'd personally screwed up their lives. Later that day, my dad pulled me aside and told me it might be best if I kept my head down for a while. He didn't say I'd done the wrong thing, but he made it clear he wasn't exactly proud of me either. I ended up driving back to my apartment that night, even though I hadn't planned to leave so soon. I didn't know what to do anymore. The whole thing felt like it had spiraled out of control, and no matter where I turned, someone was pissed off about it. But what hit me hardest came a few days later. I was walking out of class when the girl who'd worn the tank top, the one Dr. R embarrassed in front of everyone, caught up with me. I figured she was going to say thanks or something, but instead she just looked pissed. She told me she appreciated what I tried to do, but since Dr. R got fired, people had been giving her hell too. Guys were whispering about her, blaming her for everything even though she hadn't done anything. One guy even called her the slut that got Dr. R fired, loud enough for other people to hear. She told me she didn't even feel safe coming to class anymore. I didn't know what to say to her. I kept thinking I'd done the right thing, but now I was wondering if I'd just made things worse for everyone. Things kept piling up after that. Every time I thought I'd hit the bottom of this mess, something else would get dragged into it. I'd expected some people to be upset about Dr. R getting fired, but I didn't think it would stretch so far beyond campus. One afternoon, I was walking to my car when I noticed my aunt, my dad's sister, standing on the sidewalk across from the parking lot. She didn't even look at me when I called out. I walked over, and before I could say anything, she told me I'd embarrassed the family. I didn't even know what she meant at first, but then she went off about how her boss had been friends with Dr. R. Apparently, Dr. R's firing had turned into some big deal in their social circle, and now her boss was pissed. She kept saying things like, "You should have known better, and some things aren't worth the trouble." I barely got a word in before she left, but that wasn't even the worst part. Later that week, my mom called me sounding panicked. My uncle, the one who'd ranted about me before, had told my grandparents what happened. My grandma had started crying, convinced I was going to ruin my life for stirring things up. My grandpa, the most laid-back guy I know, was furious. He told my mom I was a disgrace for taking down a hard-working man just to make a point. I tried to let it go. I figured my grandparents would cool off, but they didn't. A few days later, I went over to their place for dinner. My grandma didn't say a word to me, just kept her eyes on her plate the whole time. My grandpa kept grilling me about what I thought I'd accomplished. He said Dr. R was just old-fashioned, and that guys talk like that sometimes. He asked if I was proud of myself for ruining a man's reputation. I didn't bother defending myself. I knew nothing I said was going to change his mind. Back at school, things weren't any better. The girl Dr. R had targeted wasn't even coming to class anymore. I asked one of her friends about it, and apparently, she dropped the course entirely. Guys had been whispering about her every time she walked into a room, and some idiot even drew something nasty on her notebook while she was in the bathroom one day. Then, a guy from my study group, someone I'd known since my first year, told me straight up that he didn't want to work with me anymore. He said people didn't trust me because they thought I'd snitch on anyone who pissed me off. I started skipping social stuff altogether. I'd go to class, do my work, and go home. My roommates weren't talking to me, so I just stayed in my room most nights. I stopped answering texts unless it was important, and after a while, people just stopped bothering. Then one night, I was at my parents' place again when I overheard my mom on the phone. She was arguing with my aunt, the same one who cornered me outside the parking lot, and I caught bits and pieces of her saying stuff like, "He did what was right, and this has gone too far." My aunt must have been yelling because even from the next room, I could hear her saying my name. When my mom hung up, she came into the kitchen and told me my uncle had started telling people I'd done all this because I was jealous of my cousin. Apparently, he was telling anyone who'd listened that I'd targeted Dr. R because I was bitter my cousin was more successful than me. I wasn't even close with my cousin. We'd barely talked in years, but my uncle was out there painting me like some bitter loser trying to drag his family down. I couldn't believe how fast this whole thing had spiraled. I'd recorded Dr. R because he was humiliating people and making them feel like garbage. I hadn't expected it to turn into some family-wide meltdown where my relatives were treating me like I'd committed a crime. The final blow came from someone I hadn't even thought would care, my dad's coworker. I'd picked up a part-time job working at the same company as my dad over the summer, just some basic office work to make extra cash. I'd been there long enough that most people knew me, and I figured I was on good terms with everyone. Then one afternoon, I overheard two guys near the break room talking about me. One of them said I was that kid who got the professor fired and laughed about how I must be some kind of professional tattletale. Later that day, my supervisor called me into his office. He didn't say much, just told me they were restructuring some of the temporary positions and that my spot wasn't available anymore. I knew what that meant. When I told my dad, he didn't say much, just grunted like he wasn't surprised. The worst part about all this wasn't even the people whispering behind my back or the way my family kept dragging my name through the dirt. It was the fact that the girl Dr. R humiliated, the whole reason I'd started recording in the first place, was still stuck cleaning up the mess. I ran into her once outside the library. She barely said anything to me, just nodded when I asked if she was all right. Before she walked away, she said she didn't think coming forward was worth it anymore. That hit harder than anything else. I'd thought I was doing the right thing, thought I was helping people, but now it felt like everything I'd done had just made things worse. The whole thing just kept spreading. I don't know what I expected, but I thought once the school handled it, things would eventually calm down. Instead, it felt like every new day brought something else. One afternoon, I got a call from my cousin, the one my uncle claimed I was jealous of. I hadn't talked to him in months, so I wasn't sure what to expect. At first, he started off acting like he was just checking in, asking how school was going and if I was still living with my roommates. But then he dropped it. Apparently, one of his professors had found out about the Dr. R thing and told him to be careful who he associates with. My cousin was furious because Dr. R had written him a glowing letter of recommendation, and now some professors were questioning it. He claimed he'd already lost out on an internship because one of the hiring managers knew about the whole thing. I tried explaining that I didn't even know my cousin was close to Dr. R when I sent the recordings. He didn't care. He said I should have thought about how this would affect other people before starting a witch hunt. Before he hung up, he warned me that my uncle was going to make sure I paid for it. I didn't take that part seriously at first. My uncle's the type who talks big but never really follows through on anything. But about a week later, things started getting weird. I'd parked my car in the usual lot near campus, and when I came back from class, there was a note on my windshield. It wasn't threatening, but it was just weird. Someone had scrawled, "You're next," in red marker, with no explanation. I thought it was some dumb prank until I noticed my back tire was flat. I figured it was just bad luck, so I grabbed my spare from the trunk and started changing it. While I was working, this guy walked past me, one of the guys who used to hang out with my roommates. He didn't say anything, but he grinned like he knew something I didn't. The next day, I woke up to find someone had dumped garbage across the hood of my car. Empty beer bottles, food wrappers, nothing serious, but it felt deliberate. After that, I started parking in a different lot just to avoid trouble. I didn't tell my parents right away. I figured my dad would just tell me to toughen up or something. But then my mom called me one morning, completely panicked. She told me my uncle had shown up at their house the night before and started yelling in the driveway. My dad had to physically shove him back to his car after he refused to leave. Apparently, my uncle had been drinking and was going off about how I'd ruined his son's future and destroyed a good man's career. My mom kept saying she couldn't believe how angry he was. That same week, I found out that one of my old classmates, a guy I barely knew, had started spreading rumors that I'd faked the recordings. He claimed I'd edited everything to make Dr. R sound worse than he really was. I don't know where he got that idea, but people were actually believing it. Even some of the girls who'd thanked me before started acting distant. At that point, I felt like I couldn't trust anyone. My roommates barely spoke to me, people in class avoided me, and my family was a mess. I started keeping my door locked at all times, even when I was home. The worst of it came one night when I was grabbing groceries. I'd just finished loading my bags into the trunk when this car rolled up behind me. The headlights were off, but I could make out two guys inside. One of them was the same guy who'd grinned at me when I was changing my tire. Neither of them got out, but they just sat there watching me. I stood there for a second, pretending to check my phone, hoping they'd just drive away. They didn't. Instead, one of them rolled down the window and asked me if I liked getting people fired. I didn't answer. I just got in my car, locked the doors, and started the engine. They didn't follow me when I pulled out, but they sat there the whole time just parked and watching. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I called my mom and told her everything. The tire, the garbage, the guys following me. I didn't even finish before she interrupted and said she was coming to get me. When she showed up, she brought my dad with her. He didn't say much during the drive home, just kept gripping the steering wheel like he was holding back from saying something. When we got to the house, my mom told me to go inside. That night, I overheard my parents talking in the kitchen. My dad was angry, not at me this time, but at my uncle. Apparently, my uncle had been stirring things up at his job too. My dad's boss had pulled him aside the day before and asked if he knew anything about that mess with his kid at the university. My uncle had been telling anyone who'd listen that my dad was somehow involved in what happened with Dr. R. My dad doesn't lose his temper often, but when I peeked into the kitchen, he was pacing back and forth, ranting about how my uncle was trying to ruin the family over nothing. The next morning, my dad called my uncle directly. He didn't even bother lowering his voice. I could hear him all the way from my room. He told my uncle if he ever showed up at the house again or tried to drag our family's name through the dirt, there'd be consequences. I didn't know what that meant, but my dad doesn't bluff. For a while, I thought things might finally be calming down, but then my grandma called. I picked up thinking she'd finally decided to put everything behind her, but no. She said my uncle had told her I was ruining the family name and that she didn't know if she could forgive me for what I'd done. Before I could respond, she told me she didn't want me coming to Christmas that year. That one hurt more than anything else. My grandparents were always big on family holidays, and the idea that I wasn't even welcome at the table over this felt impossible. At that point, I just gave up. I stopped talking to most people outside of class, barely answered texts from friends, and kept my head down. It felt like no matter what I did, I'd pissed off the wrong people and made things worse for myself. But then something happened I didn't expect. One of the girls from Dr. R's old class reached out to me. She'd heard about everything that was going on and wanted to let me know that she was filing her own complaint. Not just about Dr. R, but about another professor who'd been doing the same kind of crap. She said what I'd done had finally made her feel like she had proof people would listen if she spoke up. I didn't know what to say to that. After everything that had happened, I figured most people hated me by now. Hearing that someone actually felt safer because of what I'd done, that's when I realized maybe it wasn't all pointless after all. I thought things might finally start settling down after that girl reached out to me. It gave me this weird sense of relief, like maybe everything I went through hadn't been for nothing. But things never seemed to go that easily, and this whole mess still had more to throw at me. About a week after she told me she was filing her own complaint, my cousin texted me. I ignored it at first, assuming it was just another passive-aggressive jab about the internship or some other excuse for him to unload on me. But he kept texting, and when I finally read the messages, I froze. He said my uncle had been bragging about how he was gonna set things right at some bar the night before. Apparently, he'd been running his mouth to anyone who'd listen, claiming he had a plan to make sure everyone knew what kind of kid I was. My cousin didn't know what exactly my uncle meant, but he told me to watch my back. I didn't know what to make of it. My uncle was loud and dramatic, but he was all talk most of the time. Still, something about it stuck with me. 2 days later, I found out exactly what he meant. I was heading to class when one of my professors, not Dr. R, but someone else from the department, stopped me in the hallway. He said the dean wanted to see me immediately. I didn't ask why. I just grabbed my bag and went straight there. When I walked in, the dean wasn't alone. There was a man sitting across from him, some middle-aged guy in a cheap suit with a clipboard in his lap. The dean introduced him as a private investigator, hired by an outside party to look into my actions regarding Dr. R's firing. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Apparently, my uncle had hired this guy to dig into my history of stirring up trouble, as he put it. The investigator asked me questions about everything: my time in Dr. R's class, my grades, my friends, even where I'd been on specific dates. He hinted that I'd been manipulating evidence and targeting Dr. R because I had some personal grudge. I didn't know how to respond. The whole thing felt insane, like I was being accused of running some kind of elaborate scheme. When I asked what exactly my uncle was trying to prove, the investigator smiled like he was waiting for me to ask that. He handed the dean a stack of printed emails, messages that looked like I'd been bragging to my friends about getting Dr. R out of the way and teaching him a lesson. The emails were fake. They had my name, my email address, even my old dorm room number on them, but I hadn't written any of that. The dean didn't say much, just said the university's legal team would be looking into it. I left his office feeling completely blindsided. Later that night, I called my cousin and told him what happened. He swore up and down that his dad wouldn't have faked those emails himself, but he admitted his dad had been running his mouth about taking matters into his own hands. My cousin figured my uncle must have paid someone, maybe a tech guy or some random friend, to create the emails and make me look bad. I spent the next week on edge, waiting for someone to knock on my door with more bad news. Then my mom called, sounding completely shaken. My uncle had driven to my grandparents' house and gotten into a screaming match with my dad right there in the driveway. My uncle was waving around some folder full of those fake emails, trying to convince my grandparents I'd lied about everything. Apparently, my dad lost it. He grabbed the folder, tore the papers in half, and told my uncle to stay the hell away from our family. My mom said it nearly came to blows, and my grandpa had to step in before things got worse. The next morning, my dad called me. He didn't exactly apologize for how he'd treated me before, but he told me I was right to do what I did and that he'd handle things if my uncle kept stirring things up. I don't know what happened after that, but my uncle went quiet. He didn't reach out to me again, and my cousin said he was telling people he was done wasting his time on me. I thought that might finally be the end of it. I tried to move on, focused on my finals, kept my head down, and avoided any unnecessary drama. But a few days before the semester ended, something happened that shook me all over again. I was walking across campus when one of Dr. R's old friends, another professor from the department, stopped me. He didn't ask how I was doing or if I had time to talk. He just looked me dead in the eye and said, "You made a lot of enemies doing what you did. Don't think people are just going to forget." I didn't know what to say. The guy walked away like he hadn't just thrown that at me in the middle of the sidewalk. That's when I realized this whole thing was never going to completely go away. People weren't going to forget, and some of them were always going to blame me, no matter how much proof I had or how badly Dr. R deserved what happened. I didn't know what my future was going to look like anymore. Graduation was coming up, and I wasn't sure if this whole mess was going to follow me into whatever came next. All I knew was I couldn't take back what I'd done, and I still wasn't sure if that was a good thing or not. Graduation was getting closer, but I wasn't excited about it. The whole thing felt like I was limping toward the finish line, just trying to get through it without anything else blowing up. People were still whispering behind my back, and the rumors about me faking those emails were still floating around. Even though the university eventually confirmed the emails were fake, no one seemed to care. Some people just decided I was guilty no matter what the truth was. I kept my head down, avoided my uncle's side of the family completely, and spent most of my time just trying to pass my finals. I figured if I could just make it through the semester, I could finally put all of this behind me. One afternoon, I got home from class and noticed something weird. The door to my apartment was unlocked. My roommates had already moved out a week earlier, so I was the only one still staying there. I stepped inside, and right away I knew someone had been in there. My backpack had been dumped out on the floor, my desk drawers were open, and a bunch of papers were scattered across my bed. Nothing valuable was missing. My laptop was still there, my wallet was untouched, but it was clear someone had gone through my stuff. I had no idea who it could have been. There was no sign of forced entry, so I figured maybe I'd forgotten to lock the door. I called the landlord just in case, and he said no one else should have had access. He suggested it was probably just some drunk idiot wandering in by mistake. I didn't believe that, but I didn't have anything else to go on. A couple days later, I found out exactly what was going on. I was walking to my car after class when a guy I didn't recognize stopped me. He was probably in his late 40s, wearing an old baseball cap and a stained hoodie. He grinned like we were friends, then held out a manila envelope. When I asked what it was, he just told me my uncle wanted me to have it. I waited until I got home to open it. Inside was a thick stack of printed out screenshots, posts from some anonymous social media account accusing me of being a liar, a manipulator, and someone who set out to destroy innocent men. Some of the posts claimed I'd blackmailed Dr. R. Others said I'd been trying to ruin my cousin's reputation because I was jealous of his perfect life. It was insane. Just pages and pages of twisted stories mixed with fake screenshots of messages that I'd supposedly sent. There was one printout that stuck out the most. A fake email that looked like I'd messaged one of the girls from Dr. R's class, telling her to pretend she was upset so we could get rid of the old creep. I knew it was fake, but the fact that someone had put this much effort into dragging me through the dirt made me sick. I didn't know what to do. If I went back to the university about this, I knew some people would just say I was causing more drama. If I ignored it, I knew it could get worse. I finally decided to tell my dad. When I showed him the envelope, he didn't say anything for a long time. He just flipped through the papers slowly, like he was trying to absorb every detail. Then he grabbed his keys and told me to get in the car. I didn't know where we were going until we pulled into my uncle's driveway. My dad didn't even bother knocking. He just walked right in. I followed him, and before I could even say anything, my dad was already shouting. My uncle was in the kitchen drinking a beer, and the second he saw us, he started laughing. He didn't even deny it. He just stood there like this whole thing was funny. He said if I wanted to ruin people's lives, I'd better be ready for someone to fight back. My dad grabbed him by the shirt and shoved him up against the fridge. I'd never seen him like that before. He kept shouting about how my uncle had dragged the whole family into this and that he'd gone too far. My aunt ran in and started screaming at my dad to let go, and my cousin came rushing down the stairs trying to break things up. It ended with my dad dragging me back out the door. On the way home, he kept mumbling to himself about how my uncle was out of his mind and how he was done pretending to be civil. The next day, my dad called my grandparents and told them everything. The break-in, the fake screenshots, the social media posts. I don't know what my uncle had told them before, but whatever it was, it must have been bad because my grandma finally called me that evening. She didn't apologize, but she asked if I was okay. That was her way of admitting she'd been wrong. I finished my finals, packed up my stuff, and left that apartment for good. I moved back home for a couple months while I sorted things out. About a week before graduation, I got a message from the girl Dr. R had humiliated, the one in the tank top. She told me she'd heard about what my uncle had done and wanted to make sure I was okay. She also said she was finally feeling like things had started to get better for her, that people had backed off and she was finally starting to feel normal again. I didn't know how to respond to that. After everything that had happened, I wasn't sure if what I'd done had helped her or just dragged her through more chaos. But she thanked me, told me she knew what I did wasn't easy and that it meant more than I probably realized. I still don't know if I'd do it all the same way if I had the chance to go back. I know I can't fix the way people look at me now. Some of them will probably always believe I'm some bitter kid who stirred up trouble for no reason. But when I walked across that stage at graduation, I saw my parents in the crowd, both of them, sitting together like nothing had ever been wrong. My grandma was there too. She didn't say much afterward, but she gave me this quick hug before she left. My uncle didn't show up, and honestly, I was glad he didn't. I don't know what's going to happen next, but I'm done apologizing for what I did. Thanks for watching. If you liked the story, hit subscribe. See you in the next one.